It was a bright morning at the heart of the city, where the foreign embassy stood like a fortress of tradition and diplomacy. Its tall, gleaming walls reflected the sunlight, and the neatly trimmed gardens gave the place a sense of calm and order. Inside, the marble floors shone under the careful footsteps of staff and guests, while the air carried a mixture of subtle perfume, polished wood, and the faint hum of conversation. The embassy was hosting a series of events for visiting foreign officers, diplomats, and important guests from around the world. It was a day marked for ceremonial duties, formal greetings, and moments that would be remembered in official reports for years to come. Among the visiting officers was Colonel Richard Hayes, a man of confident bearing and sharp uniform. He was experienced in military protocol, having spent decades in various international assignments. For him, ceremonies were familiar, and gestures of respect such as salutes were almost instinctive. Yet, as he walked through the embassy's grand halls, he noticed something that immediately drew his attention: a royal guard standing at the entrance of the main courtyard. The guard was an imposing figure, dressed in traditional ceremonial attire. His uniform gleamed with precise folds, polished buttons, and a hat that seemed almost symbolic of the history it represented. He stood motionless, his posture rigid yet calm, every muscle controlled as if carved from stone. The guard's eyes faced forward, his expression unreadable, and yet there was a quiet intensity in the way he held himself. It was clear to anyone looking that this was a person who did not move without purpose, whose presence alone commanded attention and respect. Colonel Hayes paused for a moment. He had seen ceremonial guards before in other countries, but something about this particular guard seemed different. There was a sense of discipline that went beyond routine, a sense that this was not just a soldier following orders but someone embodying the pride and dignity of an entire nation. Curious and, perhaps, a little playful, the colonel decided to test the situation. He raised his hand in a formal gesture and expected the guard to respond with a polite military salute, the kind of acknowledgement he had received countless times during official visits elsewhere. To his surprise, the guard did not move. Not a flicker of the hand, not the slightest change in posture. The guard remained perfectly still, eyes straight ahead, unmoving. The colonel frowned slightly, raising his hand again, this time with a more insistent motion. He looked around for reactions and noticed that the embassy staff had paused their tasks and were now observing the interaction with subtle expressions of concern. Some whispered to each other, their voices low and anxious, while others simply watched silently, understanding the gravity of the situation before anyone else could fully explain it. The courtyard seemed to shrink in the tension that had quietly built up. The polished stones reflected the sunlight in a harsh way, almost highlighting the contrast between the colonel's casual gesture and the guard's unwavering presence. Colonel Hayes, who had always relied on experience and confidence, suddenly felt a small flicker of uncertainty. He was a man used to respect being given as easily as it was received, yet this guard was unlike anyone he had ever encountered. The officer was beginning to sense that the guard's actions, or lack thereof, were not a matter of disrespect but of something deeper, something rooted in rules, history, and duty. As the colonel hesitated, trying to understand the situation, he noticed other visitors taking note as well. Some glanced nervously at the guard, while others exchanged curious whispers. The staff of the embassy moved subtly, their hands adjusting papers and documents, pretending to focus on work while keeping a careful watch. Even the birds in the surrounding gardens seemed to pause momentarily, as if the stillness of the guard had extended beyond the courtyard itself. Every detail of the scene added to the tension, creating a quiet theater of observation that made the moment feel larger than life. Colonel Hayes, realizing that the standard gestures of military courtesy might not apply in this situation, took a small step back. He studied the guard closely. The man's uniform, so immaculately maintained, spoke of years of training and preparation. His stance suggested endless hours of practice, each movement perfected over time. The eyes of the guard, though focused straight ahead, held a certain weight, a silent communication that this was not a person to be hurried, commanded, or casually tested. Every fiber of his being seemed dedicated to one purpose: serving his country and obeying the principles instilled in him, no matter the circumstances. For a few moments, The colonel felt a strange mixture of respect and curiosity. He had witnessed many forms of military discipline, but this was something different. It was ceremonial, yes, but it carried the intangible quality of honor that could not be measured by protocol books or rules. This guard's discipline was not about order or appearance alone, it was about representing a nation's dignity. Colonel Hayes realized, almost instinctively, that any gesture he made here needed to be considered carefully. The surrounding staff seemed to sense this shift in the colonel's understanding. A few whispered quietly, sharing their thoughts about the unusual scene. "He's new," one said softly. "He doesn't yet understand the weight of tradition." Another replied, but the guard remained silent, unfazed by speculation or curiosity, as if existing in a different realm where only duty mattered. The colonel, too, began to understand that this was more than a moment of personal interaction. It was a glimpse into a living history, a tradition that had been maintained through decades of ceremonies, regulations, and national pride. After a few moments of careful observation, Colonel Hayes lowered his hand slightly, still studying the guard. The tension in the courtyard had not diminished. If anything, it had grown as people realized they were witnessing something meaningful. The officer's initial expectation that a simple gesture would produce a predictable response had been completely overturned. He understood that this was not a man who saluted on command from a foreign visitor. This was a man whose actions were dictated by allegiance, training, and the centuries-old rules of the Royal Guard. It was in this silence that the colonel's thoughts began to shift. He remembered reading about ceremonial guards in history books, how they represented the authority and continuity of a nation. Yet seeing it in person was different. There was a physical presence, a weight to the guard's stillness, that made it clear this was not performance alone. It was a statement of loyalty, discipline, and integrity. The colonel felt a growing admiration for the man, tempered with a sense of humility. He was a visitor in a world that demanded respect for traditions far older than his own experience. As the minutes passed, Colonel Hayes realized that this encounter would stay with him long after the embassy visit ended. The guard, standing motionless and unwavering, had communicated more in silence than most could ever express in words. Every detail of his posture, every fraction of attention, conveyed a message of dedication and pride that transcended language and protocol. The colonel began to reflect on the lessons embedded in the moment. That respect is earned through actions, not demanded by rank. That tradition carries weight that cannot be ignored, and that sometimes the most profound statements are made without a single word or gesture. By the time the colonel finally stepped back and moved along, he carried with him a sense of awe and respect. The Royal Guard remained in his place, unchanged and resolute, a silent sentinel of history and honor. The courtyard slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the impression left on Colonel Hayes was profound. He knew he had witnessed something rare, an example of human discipline and integrity so strong that it could shake even the expectations of a seasoned officer. And so, the first part of the story concluded not with action, but with observation, reflection, and the quiet power of respect. What seemed like a simple test, a gesture to see if a salute would be returned, turned into an unforgettable lesson in the value of tradition, discipline, and honor. The embassy, for all its grandeur, had offered the colonel not just a ceremony, but a glimpse into the soul of a nation, captured in the form of one royal guard, standing firm and resolute against the expectations of the world outside. The air in the embassy courtyard remained thick with quiet tension even after Colonel Hayes stepped back. Guests and staff alike were still observing the royal guard, fascinated by the unwavering figure who seemed completely unaffected by the attention. Conversations were hushed now, almost reverent, as if everyone present instinctively understood that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. Some of the diplomats whispered to one another, while others simply watched, their expressions a mixture of curiosity, respect, and awe. Colonel Hayes, standing a few steps away, could feel his own heartbeat quicken. He had expected a simple interaction, a customary salute, perhaps a nod of acknowledgement. But what he had received instead was a silent demonstration of absolute discipline. The guard's stillness, his unwavering focus, and his perfect posture were not just ceremonial. They were a statement. They conveyed a message of pride, duty, and adherence to tradition that could not be ignored. For the first time, the colonel began to sense that he was not merely observing a ceremony but witnessing a living symbol of a nation's values. The embassy staff were careful not to draw attention to themselves, but their subtle movements revealed a wealth of experience in handling such delicate situations. A few of the senior officials exchanged glances, silently assessing whether the visitor understood the gravity of the moment. The royal guard was not someone who could be treated casually, and even seasoned diplomats recognized that. It was clear that any gesture, any command, or even a simple expectation could be misinterpreted if not approached with understanding and respect. Colonel Hayes, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, took a slow breath and tried to process what he was seeing. The royal guard's unwavering focus and composure were unlike anything he had encountered in his career. In his mind, he compared this moment to other ceremonial encounters. He had experienced honor guards in other countries, soldiers standing at attention, and military personnel responding to salutes. Yet, none of those experiences came close to this. There was an almost sacred quality to the guard's demeanor, as if he were not just performing a duty but embodying the honor and integrity of generations past. As he studied the guard, the colonel noticed subtle details that added depth to his understanding. The uniform, meticulously maintained, spoke of countless hours spent in preparation and care. Every crease, every button, every insignia seemed deliberate and meaningful. The guard's gloves were immaculate, his boots shined to perfection, and even the way he held his stance suggested an awareness of every tiny motion. It was a living demonstration of precision, commitment, and respect for the traditions that shaped him. The colonel's thoughts wandered to the history of the royal guards, stories he had read but never truly imagined witnessing. He remembered accounts of guards who had stood in their posts through extreme weather, during ceremonies of historic importance, and even in moments of personal danger. Each guard was trained not only to perform physical tasks but also to carry the weight of symbolic responsibility. They were representatives of a nation's pride, its history, and its values. And now, in front of Colonel Hayes, one of these guards stood fully aware of the power and importance of his role. Around the courtyard, whispers continued to circulate. Some of the younger staff looked at the scene with wide eyes, perhaps experiencing for the first time the depth of ceremonial tradition. Others, more seasoned, simply nodded, recognizing the significance without needing to explain it. There was a shared understanding that this was not merely a test of obedience but a lesson in respect and decorum. Colonel Hayes could feel the weight of these silent observations pressing gently but insistently on him, reminding him that he was a guest in a space governed by rules that went far beyond his own experience. The colonel, always confident in his ability to navigate military protocol, now found himself treading carefully. He realized that the usual assumptions he held about authority, rank, and expected responses did not apply here. The royal guard answered only to a higher authority, bound by centuries of tradition and duty that demanded absolute loyalty. Any attempt to impose his own expectations would not only be inappropriate but might even come across as disrespectful. Colonel Hayes felt a mix of humility and curiosity, recognizing that this encounter was teaching him something far greater than etiquette. It was teaching him about honor, cultural respect, and the power of restraint. The tension in the courtyard did not diminish, and time seemed to stretch as the colonel observed the guard more closely. He noticed the subtle movements that indicated absolute focus, the slight adjustment of the stance, the minute shifts in weight that kept the posture perfect, the way the guard's eyes remained fixed on a point ahead without wavering. It was a level of discipline that could only be achieved through years of rigorous training, patience, and unwavering commitment. Colonel Hayes understood, in that moment, that this guard's actions were not about obedience alone. They were about embodying a principle, a standard, and a respect for tradition that transcended personal will. Nearby, the embassy officials quietly began discussing the situation in low voices. They were aware of the colonel's curiosity and the potential misunderstanding, but they also recognized an opportunity to demonstrate the importance of tradition and protocol to a foreign visitor. He does not respond to gestures from anyone but his sovereign. One official whispered, "It is not defiance, "It is duty," another replied. These explanations, though subtle, offered a window into the world of the royal guard, a world where respect and honor were expressed not through words, but through unwavering presence. Colonel Hayes reflected on these insights, feeling a growing sense of respect for the guard and for the traditions he represented. He realized that what he had initially perceived as rigidity or stubbornness was, in fact, a profound demonstration of discipline and loyalty. The guard was not just performing a role, he was living it, breathing it, and conveying it silently to everyone present. In that moment, Colonel Hayes felt a mixture of admiration and introspection. Recognizing that the world was full of customs and values that could not be understood through experience alone, they had to be observed, appreciated, and respected. As the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the courtyard began to shift subtly. The initial tension gave way to a quiet sense of reverence. Guests, staff, and even the colonel himself were drawn into the shared understanding of what it meant to serve with honor. The royal guard, still standing motionless, had created a powerful lesson through his mere presence. The colonel realized that the encounter had evolved from a simple test into an educational experience, one that highlighted the importance of tradition, discipline, and unwavering loyalty. Colonel Hayes began to appreciate the depth of symbolism behind the royal guard's actions. Every detail of posture, uniform, and gaze carried meaning. The guard's refusal to respond to a foreign command was not disrespect. It was a testament to his allegiance, his discipline, and the sacred responsibilities he bore. The colonel felt a growing sense of humility, understanding that true respect for tradition required more than compliance. It required observation, patience, and acknowledgement of principles greater than oneself. In the midst of this reflection, the colonel noticed other guests quietly taking notes in their minds, recording the lessons of the moment. Some exchanged small smiles, recognizing the universality of the message. Honor and duty can transcend words, actions, and expectations. Others simply observed, allowing the experience to resonate quietly within them. The embassy, usually a place of formal procedure, had transformed into a stage for a living demonstration of values that could not be taught through instruction alone. By the time Colonel Hayes finally lowered his hand and stepped back, he felt a profound shift within himself. The royal guard had not moved, not saluted, and yet had spoken volumes without uttering a word. The lesson was clear. Discipline, respect, and adherence to tradition were qualities that defined a nation, and understanding them required more than observation. It required mindfulness and appreciation. As he moved away, the colonel could not help but glance back one last time. The guard remained perfectly still, a figure of unwavering resolve, silently commanding respect from all who watched. Colonel Hayes understood that he had been witness to something rare, a living embodiment of centuries of tradition, duty, and pride. This moment, simple in its form, yet profound in its message, would remain etched in his memory for years to come. The courtyard slowly returned to its usual rhythm, yet the impression lingered. Guests resumed conversations, staff attended to duties, and the sun continued its path across the sky. Yet for Colonel Hayes, and for those who had observed closely, the encounter with the Royal Guard had created a lasting understanding of what it truly meant to serve with honor, respect, and unwavering dedication. It was a lesson that would shape the colonel's perspective, not just in diplomatic protocol, but in life itself, a reminder that true discipline and loyalty often speak louder than words ever could. The quiet in the embassy courtyard stretched longer than anyone expected. Colonel Hayes, though still trying to absorb the earlier lesson, sensed that the moment was far from over. The Royal Guard remained immovable, but there was an unmistakable air of tension building around him. Guests shifted slightly, whispers circulated again, and even the staff seemed to lean forward just a little, as if drawn in by the silent power of the scene. Something was about to happen, and everyone, knowingly or unknowingly, waited to witness it. Colonel Hayes felt his curiosity surge again. He had spent a lifetime following protocol, commanding respect, and giving it in return. But now, Faced with this singular figure, he realized that his usual methods of testing or assessing military discipline would not apply. He wondered how a man could remain so calm, so precise, and yet carry such an unmistakable sense of authority without saying a word. It was as if the guard's mere presence spoke louder than any command, gesture, or conversation could. Then, slowly, the guard made the first sign of movement, not a salute, not a nod, but a subtle shift of weight that suggested he was about to address the situation in a way no one had expected. Colonel Hayes leaned slightly forward, instinctively alert. The other guests held their breath. The silence seemed to amplify every sound: the soft rustle of the guard's uniform, the distant ticking of a wall clock, and the faint whisper of the wind moving through the trees of the embassy garden. Finally, in a calm, measured voice, the royal guard spoke. His words were deliberate and clear, yet there was no trace of anger or disrespect. "Sir," he began, "I am honored by your presence. I serve to represent the crown and follow its orders. My duty is not to salute foreign officers unless specifically directed by my sovereign or the protocol office." The colonel, who had anticipated a simple action rather than words, paused. A mixture of surprise, respect, and admiration ran through him. He realized that this guard's response was not defiance, it was integrity, discipline, and unwavering adherence to duty. The guests in the courtyard, who had been quietly observing, now reacted subtly, some nodding in approval, others whispering quietly among themselves. The embassy staff exchanged glances, silently confirming that the guard had handled the situation perfectly, maintaining both decorum and respect. Colonel Hayes straightened, recognizing the significance of the moment. In his long career, he had faced tense negotiations, military challenges, and diplomatic confrontations. But few experiences had taught him so much about the power of restraint and respect. The Royal Guard's reaction was a lesson not in obedience to authority alone, but in loyalty to principles far greater than any single individual or circumstance. The guard continued, maintaining his impeccable composure. "I understand your expectation, sir, and I do not take it lightly. My actions are guided by tradition, and my respect for protocol is unwavering. Please understand that my duty is to my country, and it is expressed through adherence to the rules set forth by those I serve." His voice was calm, steady, and carried an authority that seemed far greater than his physical presence. There was a quiet power in his words, an undeniable weight that made everyone around feel the importance of discipline and honor. Colonel Hayes, though initially embarrassed for having tested the guard, found himself impressed. Here was a man who had taken centuries of tradition, discipline, and ceremonial expectation, and lived it fully, without hesitation or compromise. The colonel realized that this was not a simple lesson in etiquette or protocol. It was a profound example of personal integrity, courage, and the strength that comes from unwavering commitment to one's duty. The guests and staff in the courtyard absorbed the exchange silently. Some began to understand the depth of what had just occurred. The Royal Guard had demonstrated that respect and authority do not come from rank alone, but from a clear understanding of one's responsibilities, the courage to uphold principles, and the discipline to act with unwavering consistency. The colonel felt a sense of humility, recognizing that his usual assumptions about authority, respect, and ceremony were being challenged in a way he had never anticipated. As the guard spoke, he continued to convey not only the rules of protocol, but also the underlying philosophy of his service. Every gesture, every measured word, reinforced the idea that discipline and respect are inseparable from duty. He did not need to shout, to move aggressively, or to assert dominance. His calm and composed presence, combined with clear, respectful communication, was enough to command attention and admiration. It was a living demonstration of the kind of leadership that inspires trust, loyalty, and respect, not through fear or intimidation, but through integrity and principle. Colonel Hayes reflected on his own career and realized that moments like this were rare. Many leaders, many officers, had achieved temporary authority through displays of power or command, but few had witnessed an example of authority derived entirely from discipline, loyalty, and adherence to principle. The Royal Guard's reaction, simple yet profound, carried a lesson that would resonate far beyond the walls of the embassy, extending into the way the colonel thought about leadership, respect, and the responsibilities that come with service. The atmosphere in the courtyard shifted again, this time toward quiet admiration. Guests who had been initially curious now felt a sense of appreciation. The embassy staff relaxed slightly, satisfied that the situation had been handled with perfect decorum. Even the foreign officer, Colonel Hayes, felt a profound sense of connection to a tradition that, though different from his own, spoke universally about honor, loyalty, and duty. The Royal Guard's reaction had not only shaken the embassy in a figurative sense, it had also created a lasting impression that transcended cultural and national boundaries. For a few minutes, silence returned. The guard's stance remained perfect, his gaze steady, but his words had set the tone for the remainder of the encounter. Colonel Hayes, recognizing the opportunity, approached with a more measured and respectful demeanor. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for helping me understand the importance of your role and the traditions you uphold. It is clear that your commitment is extraordinary." The guard acknowledged the words with a subtle nod, maintaining his calm composure. It was a small gesture, yet it carried enormous meaning. In that moment, Colonel Hayes realized that respect is a two-way street. The guard had adhered to his duty without compromise, yet he had also communicated in a way that allowed understanding and dialogue to take place. It was a delicate balance, mastered through years of training and dedication. As the encounter concluded, the courtyard slowly returned to normal activity. Guests resumed their conversations, some exchanging reflections about the extraordinary display they had just witnessed. Staff continued their duties, though with a renewed awareness of the power of tradition and discipline. Colonel Hayes, still processing the experience, walked away with a sense of humility, admiration, and inspiration. He understood that this moment would stay with him for a lifetime. A vivid example of the profound impact of integrity, loyalty, and unwavering adherence to principle. The Royal Guard, still standing in perfect posture, had not only maintained his duty but had also imparted a lesson that went far beyond the immediate situation. His reaction had demonstrated the importance of understanding and respecting cultural differences, the power of restraint, and the enduring value of discipline and honor. Colonel Hayes now understood that the moment had been less about protocol and more about the universal principles that govern human respect and dignity. By the time the foreign officer finally stepped away, he carried with him a deep sense of reverence. The guard's words, composure, and unwavering stance had reshaped his understanding of leadership, tradition, and respect. The embassy, which had seemed like just another official venue, had transformed into a classroom of life lessons, teaching through the quiet power of a single individual who embodied centuries of history, discipline, and honor. Colonel Hayes would later recount the event to his colleagues, describing how a single Royal Guard had demonstrated that respect, integrity, and loyalty can speak more powerfully than any command, order, or gesture. It was a story of discipline, pride, and courage, the kind of story that inspires reflection, humility, and a deeper understanding of what it truly means to serve something greater than oneself. The courtyard, the sunlit walls, and the perfectly poised Royal Guard became a lasting image in the colonel's mind. He had witnessed a moment where action, restraint, and honor converged perfectly, creating an experience that was both unforgettable and profoundly educational. The Royal Guard's measured reaction had truly shaken the embassy, not through confrontation or conflict, but through the quiet, commanding presence of unwavering duty and principle. After the Royal Guard had spoken, and Colonel Hayes had stepped back, the embassy courtyard slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but the air remained charged with a quiet energy. Everyone present seemed to feel the weight of what had just occurred. Guests exchanged glances, some with smiles of admiration, others with eyes wide in disbelief at the calm authority displayed by a single man. The staff, who had witnessed many formal events, moved with a slightly different energy. Their usual efficiency now mixed with a sense of pride and respect. Colonel Hayes himself lingered for a few moments, reflecting on the encounter. The guard had not only refused a gesture that the colonel expected but had done so with dignity and clarity. It was a response that could have easily been misinterpreted as defiance. Yet it carried no arrogance or hostility. Instead, it was a lesson in loyalty, discipline, and the subtle power of upholding one's principles. He realized that the guard's actions were not meant to challenge anyone personally. They were a reflection of centuries of tradition, careful training, and unwavering commitment. Around the courtyard, whispers continued to ripple through the crowd. Some guests were visibly impressed, commenting quietly on the precision and discipline of the royal guard. "I have never seen such composure," one diplomat said under his breath. "It is remarkable how he conveys authority without moving a muscle," another replied. The subtle exchange of observations showed that the moment had made a significant impact. It was no longer just a ceremonial event. It had become a lesson in understanding, respect, and cultural sensitivity. The embassy staff, who had been observing closely, now began discussing the encounter among themselves in hushed tones. Some senior officials nodded in approval, acknowledging that the guard had handled the situation perfectly. "He followed protocol without hesitation," one whispered, "and he did it without creating tension," another responded. It was clear that the guard's adherence to tradition had earned silent recognition not just from his superiors but from everyone present. His actions were an example of professionalism at its highest level, demonstrating that discipline and respect could communicate volumes even without words. Colonel Hayes noticed that the young officers and new staff members were particularly attentive. Many had never witnessed such a clear example of ceremonial discipline, and they seemed to absorb every detail: the steady gaze, the perfect posture, the measured words, and the calm composure of the royal guard. For them, this was more than a lesson in etiquette. It was a demonstration of values that transcended individual authority. Discipline, loyalty, and respect for tradition had become tangible, living concepts right before their eyes. The colonel reflected on his own experiences in military and diplomatic settings. He had commanded troops, attended countless ceremonies, and interacted with officials from around the world. Yet he had rarely seen such a clear, powerful display of integrity. The guard's reaction was a reminder that leadership and authority were not always expressed through direct action or loud assertion. Sometimes, they were expressed through presence, patience, and adherence to a higher standard. This subtlety, the colonel realized, was far more difficult to achieve than any overt display of power. As the morning progressed, the initial tension gradually transformed into admiration and curiosity. Guests and staff began discussing the encounter in more thoughtful ways, analyzing what had just happened and what lessons could be learned. Many spoke about the importance of understanding cultural traditions when interacting with foreign officials. Colonel Hayes, listening quietly, realized that he had gained a deeper appreciation for the role of ceremonial guards and the significance of their duties. What he had initially seen as a minor test of protocol had become a profound lesson in respect and understanding. Some guests even approached the senior embassy officials to ask questions about the royal guard's role and responsibilities. They were eager to understand the rules and traditions that governed his actions. The officials explained that the guards were trained to maintain discipline, represent the nation with honor, and follow protocols set by the sovereign and the embassy authorities. Their duty was not simply to respond to individual requests, but to embody centuries of ceremonial tradition. This explanation provided context for the guard's reaction, helping everyone present appreciate the depth of his professionalism. Colonel Hayes, now fully engaged in reflection, noticed the subtle ways in which the royal guard continued to influence the atmosphere. Even as normal activities resumed, the guard's presence seemed to elevate the behavior of those around him. Conversations were quieter, movements more deliberate, and a general sense of respect permeated the courtyard. It was as if the guard had reminded everyone that honor and discipline were not just personal traits but collective responsibilities, influencing how people interacted with one another. The colonel found himself considering the broader lessons of the encounter. The royal guard's response had been measured, calm, and precise. Yet it carried a powerful message. Authority, respect, and duty are inseparable. It was a reminder that true leadership does not require force or intimidation but can be communicated through integrity, consistency, and dedication to a higher principle. The guard had demonstrated that following rules and respecting traditions were not restrictions but sources of strength and credibility. As the event continued, guests began to share their reflections more openly. Some spoke about how the encounter had challenged their assumptions about authority and obedience. Others commented on the way the guard had balanced firmness with courtesy, creating an impression of strength without confrontation. The discussions highlighted a shared understanding that the encounter had been meaningful not because of conflict, but because of clarity, composure, and respect for tradition. Colonel Hayes, observing the interactions, realized that the lessons extended beyond protocol. They were lessons about human behavior, respect for cultural norms, and the subtle power of restraint. The Royal Guard had not only performed his duty flawlessly but had also created a moment of education and reflection for everyone present. It was an example of how discipline and tradition, when upheld with integrity, can influence and inspire others without a single act of aggression or defiance. The young officers present seemed particularly affected. They whispered among themselves, sharing thoughts about what it meant to serve with honor and how they could apply the lessons of the day in their own careers. Some expressed admiration for the courage it took to maintain such unwavering composure under scrutiny. Others discussed how the experience demonstrated the importance of understanding the rules and traditions of any institution before attempting to assert authority. The conversation revealed that the Royal Guard's actions had created a ripple effect, inspiring reflection and discussion that extended well beyond the immediate moment. Colonel Hayes, taking a quiet moment for himself, reflected on the personal impact of the encounter. He realized that the Royal Guard's behavior had challenged his assumptions about leadership, respect, and discipline. He understood that authority was not merely a matter of rank or command. It was built on consistency, integrity, and the willingness to uphold principles even when tested. The Guard had communicated this lesson with remarkable subtlety, leaving a lasting impression that would remain with the colonel long after he left the embassy. As the event neared its conclusion, the courtyard settled into a sense of calm and order. Guests continued their conversations, staff resumed their duties, and the sunlight cast long, golden shadows across the polished floors. Yet for those who had been closely observing, the memory of the Royal Guard's stance, composure, and words lingered. Colonel Hayes walked through the courtyard one last time, glancing at the guard with deep respect. He knew he had witnessed a rare display of integrity and discipline, one that transcended cultural boundaries and spoke to universal values of honor, respect, and duty. By the time the ceremony concluded and guests began to leave, the impact of the encounter was clear. Conversations continued in small groups, reflecting on the lessons learned from the Royal Guard's unwavering discipline. Many noted that the moment had been a reminder of the importance of understanding tradition and the subtle power of presence. It was a story that would be shared and remembered, not for its drama or conflict, but for the quiet strength and integrity that had been demonstrated so clearly. Colonel Hayes, as he prepared to depart, carried the experience with him as a lasting impression. The Royal Guard had not only performed his duty with excellence, but had also created a moment of reflection, education, and inspiration. The lessons of the encounter were simple yet profound. Respect traditions, honor your duty, and understand that true authority comes from integrity and consistency. The courtyard, now calm and orderly, had become a classroom of life lessons, teaching all who were present about the enduring power of discipline, loyalty, and respect. Even after leaving the embassy, Colonel Hayes would recount the experience to colleagues and friends, describing how a single Royal Guard had conveyed lessons far beyond the immediate event. The story was one of discipline, composure, and unwavering dedication, demonstrating that true influence comes not from force, but from adherence to principles and respect for tradition. The encounter had shaken perceptions, not through confrontation, but through the quiet, commanding presence of a man who stood firmly for his duty and values. The day at the embassy was slowly coming to a close, but the events that had unfolded earlier left an impression far deeper than anyone could have anticipated. Colonel Hayes, walking through the now quiet halls, reflected on the encounter with the Royal Guard. The memory of the Guard's unwavering stance, calm demeanor, and precise words continued to resonate in his mind. He understood that what he had witnessed was not just a display of ceremonial discipline, but a living lesson in integrity, respect, and the power of adherence to principle. As he moved through the corridors, the colonel observed other guests and staff members lingering in quiet conversation. Many of them were still discussing the remarkable moment in the courtyard, analyzing the guards' behavior and sharing their own reflections. Some were astonished at how one individual could command so much respect and attention without raising his voice or making a single grand gesture. Others were inspired by the clarity and conviction with which the guard expressed his duty. It became increasingly clear to Colonel Hayes that this single encounter had created a ripple effect throughout the embassy, touching everyone who had been present. The colonel paused for a moment, recalling the initial thought that had prompted him to test the guard. What had begun as a simple curiosity had transformed into a profound lesson. He realized that the guard's response was not merely about protocol. It was about values that transcended rank, nationality, and circumstance. The Royal Guard's steadfast commitment to his duty reflected an understanding of responsibility that went beyond personal gain or recognition. It was about representing something far greater, the honor and tradition of an entire nation. Later, in a more private setting, Colonel Hayes spoke with a senior embassy official who had observed the entire encounter closely. The official explained the deeper meaning behind the guard's discipline. "Our royal guards are trained to represent not just the crown, but the principles our nation stands for," he said. "They follow centuries of tradition, and their actions are guided by honor, loyalty, and unwavering respect for protocol. What you saw today was not defiance. It was the embodiment of our values." Colonel Hayes listened attentively, absorbing every word. He began to understand the layers of responsibility that rested on the shoulders of the Royal Guard. Their role was not limited to ceremonial duties. It was a living expression of discipline, integrity, and dedication. Each guard, standing immovable and steadfast, carried the legacy of those who had served before, creating a link between the past, present, and future. The colonel realized that such commitment required extraordinary patience, training, and self-discipline, qualities that demanded respect from anyone who witnessed them. As he walked back toward the main exit, the colonel noticed the Royal Guard once again standing at attention. Despite hours of ceremonial duty, the guard's posture remained perfect, his gaze unwavering. There was no sign of fatigue or distraction, only the quiet strength that had captivated everyone earlier. The colonel felt a surge of admiration and humility, recognizing the depth of dedication it took to maintain such a presence. In that moment, he understood that true honor is demonstrated not through words or accolades, but through consistent action, patience, and respect for principles greater than oneself. The experience prompted Colonel Hayes to reflect on his own life and career. He considered the challenges he had faced, the decisions he had made, and the responsibilities he had carried. The guard's example reminded him that leadership and respect were earned not through assertiveness or dominance, but through integrity, discipline, and a willingness to uphold standards even under scrutiny. It was a humbling lesson, one that would shape his approach to leadership and diplomacy in the years to come. Later, during a formal reception, Colonel Hayes shared his reflections with fellow officers and guests. He spoke about the Royal Guard's unwavering composure, the clarity of his words, and the silent authority he commanded. "I have seen many forms of discipline and leadership," the colonel said, "but what I witnessed today is rare. This is a reminder that integrity, loyalty, and respect for tradition are qualities that speak louder than any command, rank, or gesture. We can all learn from this example." The guests listened intently, and many nodded in agreement. The story of the guard had already begun to spread, not as a tale of confrontation, but as a demonstration of values that everyone could admire. Conversations continued long into the evening, with people sharing their interpretations and personal takeaways. Some spoke of the importance of patience and understanding, while others reflected on how observing discipline could inspire better conduct in their own work and lives. Colonel Hayes, meanwhile, found himself quietly revisiting the moments in the courtyard, replaying the guard's words and actions in his mind. He realized that this encounter had done more than educate him about ceremonial protocol. It had reshaped his understanding of what it means to serve with honor. The guard's unwavering commitment to duty, expressed calmly and respectfully, was a lesson that transcended the immediate context. It was a universal reminder that true respect is earned through consistency, loyalty, and dedication to principles that guide one's actions. By the end of the day, the embassy had returned to its routine activities. But the story of the Royal Guard lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Staff members quietly admired the steadfastness of the Guard, reflecting on the dedication required to maintain such high standards. Guests shared their impressions in hushed tones, recounting the moment when one individual's presence and words had conveyed a lesson far more powerful than any formal address could have achieved. Colonel Hayes, preparing to leave the embassy, took a final look at the courtyard. The Royal Guard stood motionless, yet his presence seemed to radiate a calm authority that reached beyond the walls of the building. The colonel felt a deep sense of gratitude for having witnessed such a moment. He understood that this experience would stay with him for a lifetime, influencing not only his professional approach but also his personal understanding of discipline, respect, and the value of tradition. As he departed, the colonel reflected on the broader implications of what he had learned. The Guard's example demonstrated that leadership and respect are not merely about personal recognition or power. They are about consistency, integrity, and the courage to uphold principles, even when it might be easier to compromise. The encounter had taught him that honor is expressed not through words or gestures alone, but through sustained action, quiet dedication, and unwavering adherence to duty. In the days that followed, Colonel Hayes shared the story with his colleagues, describing the moment in detail. He recounted how the Royal Guard had maintained composure, communicated with clarity, and demonstrated the power of discipline. The story inspired others to reflect on their own professional conduct, the importance of understanding cultural and institutional traditions, and the value of integrity in leadership. What had seemed like a simple ceremonial moment had become a lesson in humility, respect, and the enduring strength of principled action. The Royal Guard, though unaware of the lasting impact he had made, continued his duties with the same dedication and precision as always. His role was not to seek recognition but to embody the values and traditions he had been trained to uphold. Yet, in quietly demonstrating the power of discipline, respect, and integrity, he had created a moment that would be remembered and shared by those who witnessed it for years to come. Colonel Hayes, reflecting on the experience one last time before leaving the city, realized that some lessons are learned, not through instruction or formal teaching, but through observation. The Royal Guard had shown that presence, composure, and adherence to principle can speak louder than any command or expectation. It was a demonstration of values that transcend borders, cultures, and professional hierarchies. For the colonel, it was a reminder that true respect, honor, and leadership are expressed through action, consistency, and fidelity to one's duty. As the sun set over the city, casting a warm glow over the embassy courtyard, the story came full circle. What had begun as a simple gesture, a salute that was expected, had transformed into an unforgettable lesson in integrity, discipline, and cultural respect. Colonel Hayes left with a renewed understanding of the importance of traditions and the silent power of principle. The Royal Guard, standing tall and unwavering, had not only fulfilled his duty, but had imparted a timeless lesson on honor, respect, and the quiet strength of loyalty. And so, the encounter that had shaken the embassy did so not through defiance or conflict, but through the calm, unwavering presence of a man devoted to his duty, a living symbol of integrity and discipline. The story became one of reflection, inspiration, and appreciation, leaving a lasting impression on all who witnessed it, especially the foreign officer who had come seeking a simple gesture, only to discover the true meaning of honor and respect.